Good afternoon, everyone. It just took me a few extra minutes there to get started. So welcome to our webinar today called How to Select and Score Fairly. As you may already know, I'm Tina Mulrooney from the Community Sector Council, and I'm working on the Creative HR project here. I just wanted to give a couple of minutes for people to join on, so I'm not going to launch any polls or anything quite yet. But I would like to know who is in the room. So I'd like to know paid staff, volunteer, or other. So I'm going to launch a poll any minute. Hopefully you can hear me well. If at any point during the presentation things go funny and you can't hear me or you can't see my screen, I would ask that you please just write in the question box down below. So as well, you can write any other questions in the question box and I will answer them at the end of the presentation or throughout should I have an opportunity. I also wanted to point out to you that we do have two handouts attached to this webinar today. So they are there. They are the resource list for how to select and score interviews fairly, and also the PowerPoint for this presentation. I'm going to have a few quick polls just to change it up a bit and make it a little bit exciting. I know it's the afternoon. It's hard to keep going sometimes immediately after lunch. So I'm going to provide you with a little bit of excitement by launching some polls. So hopefully you find that a little bit funny as well. I'm not the best at humor, but here goes. So it looks like we have everyone online here now. And if anyone joins during the presentation and has any questions at all, please just type them in the question box. The handouts are there, which I just indicated, so you can actually download them from here. If for any reason you can't download them and you want them after the session, please contact me at my email. I'm not going to go through any crazy introduction or a long introduction. I'm just going to get started here today. I wanted to let you know that this session is being recorded. However, it's just me talking, so all of you are on mute, and you do not need to worry about us hearing anything through the microphone. I always tend to put that disclaimer on the webinars. I wanted to, first of all, point you to our website, thecommunitysectorcouncil.ca. So it's www.cscnl.ca. We have lots of great events coming up, so I just wanted to mention that so you can check them out. And one of our events that's actually going on tomorrow in St. John's called Creating a Respectful Workplace. It's not full quite yet, so please do register on our webpage under events should you be able to make it. It's from 9 to 4 tomorrow, and we have a guest speaker, Lisa Birmingham from Women in Resource Development Corporation. So it's going to be a really great day. We're going to provide a light lunch at around 12 o'clock. So if you can make that and you haven't already done so, please check it out. And that's in person in St. John's at the CSC. So I'm going to move on here now. Everything looks good. If for some reason you can't see the screen or you have any questions, please type them in the question box. I'm going to assume that everyone can see my screen clearly now, as there are no questions in the question box. So to get started, I'm just going to introduce you briefly to me. My name is Tina Mulrooney, as I mentioned, and I'm a HR specialist here at the Community Sector Council, Newfoundland and Labrador. My previous work experience is in the banking industry and in the oil and gas industry in Newfoundland and Labrador. I did work within a HR department, and in the banking industry, I was a customer service supervisor for a team of about 7 people. And I did that at the ripe age of 23, so definitely a challenge, but no less an exciting experience. I do have a Master of Employment Relations at Memorial University, and my initial degree was a Bachelor of Commerce co-op with a focus in human resources. So I don't think I need to go too much into this, but I do think that looking at the background I have, you'll know that I do enjoy the people side of things, the human resources, things like that. So I'm pretty passionate about it. And if anyone has any questions specific to their nonprofit organization surrounding human resources, I would love for you to reach out, and my contact information will be at the end of this presentation. At CSC, we do believe that investing in strengthening human resources skills and improving labor market conditions is vital to the continued success of the nonprofit sector. So we're very passionate about this here. I am just checking now to see if Darlene is on the line, and she absolutely is. So I'm going to unmute you, Darlene, just in case you want to say a few words before we get started. Hi, Darlene.
Hi, Tina. I'm so glad to be here and glad to see the great turnout. Really looking forward to this session today. It fits really well with Creative HR, which is all about trying to work with nonprofit organizations to identify areas where they don't have, for example, in-house expertise and where they might need to reach out. So look forward to more information from Tina about how to go to websites for better resources, and there will be a continuing series of sessions both online and in person. So thanks for the opportunity to say hello, and I look forward to learning lots today too.
Excellent. Thank you, Darlene. I'm going to mute you again there now, and we'll get started because I know you're all excited to learn all about the topic today. So moving on, I just wanted to put up a little disclaimer here, and I always have to do this because when you're talking about sensitive situations or topics, you know, hiring, firing, any kind of human resources topics that are sensitive, you must just say that this information is purely meant to be informative and it's not intended that it's advisory in nature. So whatever I say to do today or say what the best practices are, I don't expect that this is concrete and has to be done this way. It's not legal advice. And if you read this presentation or looked at the material without looking at the entire package, you could be misled. So that's all I just want to say there. You should always read something in full before you make any decisions on something. And you need to be cognizant of your own organizations and how they work. So what might work for some doesn't necessarily work for all. So the first thing I want to start out with is planning your selection process. So the theme for today is selecting and scoring interviews fairly, and this is part of the selection process. In order to select and score fairly, you must first plan this process. As you may already know, the selection process entails screening applicants to ensure that the most appropriate candidate is hired, so the best person is hired for the job. The steps that are involved in this process include reviewing resumes, reviewing application forms, if applicable, and any supporting documentation from the job applicants. You want to see who meets the minimum qualifications, which would be stated in your job posting online or wherever you put your job posting, and eliminate those candidates that do not meet the minimum qualifications. I do have a note there to say that you can state in your job ad that those selected will be contacted for an interview. Um, Something like that, but it's generally goes without saying these days. Only those meeting the minimum qualifications will be considered. It generally goes without saying, but if you feel the need to do so, you can include this, you know, within your job ad or your job advertisement as well. You can say, you know, those famous words, only those candidates who meet the job requirements will be considered, if you have to. Okay, so this will eliminate anyone that isn't quite qualified or doesn't have the education or experience to proceed. And before I proceed, and before I forget, I'm going to launch a poll there now. So it's just a simple question that I want you to answer. So all you need to do is look on your screen and select the option that applies to you. So I want to know, how are you related to a nonprofit organization? And it looks like people are voting, so that's great. So anyone that's listening in and not looking at the screen, you just need to select the option that applies to you. And we're almost there. Okay, so anyone listening on the line, you have to select your option on the screen that applies to you. All right, we're stuck at 92%, so that means that someone's not voting. So I am going to move on, but I will tell you that out of that 92% that have voted, we have 91% paid staff listening to this webinar today and 9% other. Um, and the other may include students from the College of the North Atlantic. Definitely sent out an invite to them. They're in an exam period there now, but we thought it'd be a great opportunity to get them engaged in information about human resources in the nonprofit sector. So we're still at 92%, so I'm going to close the poll there now. And here we go. So I'm just going to share the results quickly. You can see, and now I'm going to hide them. So we're moving out of that. So if for some reason you can't see the slides on the screen, please alert me by the question box. So as I said earlier, the next step in the selection process would be to review applications and assess that those meet or exceed the minimum job qualifications. So you want to come up with a list of people who will be shortlisted for the job interview. This can be a daunting task at times, so it is sometimes helpful to involve other coworkers in this process. For example, I was actually involved in a process like this at one point, and myself and another employee took an objective view of all the applications that met or exceeded the minimum qualifications, and we both had our own opportunity to provide information on how we would rate these individuals and who we would actually interview. So this adds to the objectivity of the process itself, and it ensures that you are selecting the right person for the job. So you have a few different opinions, and I was actually involved in a process like this. Quite often you may not have this much time to do the recruitment, but it is recommended in the research to take the time to actually go through this very important step in the process. So, but it could be two coworkers in a nonprofit organization that review and make recommendations on who to select for the shortlist and, of course, the interview. You may want to even develop a selection panel. So get assistance with simply screening the applications so that you can ensure, it's not just your opinion that you're going by, and across the board, you or someone else agree that someone should be moved on in the process. So be upfront with those on the panel how much time is actually involved in this process, and be clear on what their role is in the process. So if you just want to engage somebody else to review resumes for the purposes of selecting a shortlist, then be clear with that. Make sure they know that that's their role in the process. You wouldn't want to have any confusion. An example of this is one time I worked for another organization and I was asked to participate in the recruitment process. I had about 5 resumes that the recruitment specialist wanted me to review, and I knew that that was my job. I knew I wasn't picking the person for the job or going any further than that. I was just providing my opinion on those 5 resumes and whittling them down to who I thought was the top 2 or the top 1. Your selection panel will help you do many things if you decide to implement this approach in your nonprofit organization. They can help you develop selection criteria, and as we say, a few minds are better than just one mind. They can assist in screening resumes, preparing interview questions, and even participating in the interview process. On one of my previous webinars related to recruitment, I did suggest that you should have 2 or more people sit in on an interview at all times. So I just want to bring this up again. It does help in being fair to the candidates because having 2 or more opinions really helps. It's very helpful to have a selection panel in order to assess candidates against the selection criteria to ensure that different viewpoints are taken into consideration. So the individuals on the selection panel can also provide input on the final selection if you wish. In the past, when involving others in the selection process, I found it very helpful as you can never really just trust one viewpoint. I had a really great experience actually here where we were tossing around the names of two candidates that were both exceptional and great. And in order to select our candidate, we had to talk about it and go away and have some quiet time, myself and another employee, and we rated them on our own. And when we brought the results together, we were surprised at how we actually rated the individual that got the position. And it just goes to show that it's very helpful and interesting when you see your different viewpoints. So it was great that we both thought the top candidate was the same person, and it made our jobs a little easier knowing and helped us become confident about who we ended up hiring. So a very helpful tool. Some of the best practices that you should follow when using a selection panel in the recruitment process are here on the screen. So you want to provide those on the panel with any relevant information that was provided by the job candidates in the applicant process. You want to provide full copies of their resumes and any other supporting documentation. So of course this is private and confidential information, so if you do involve others, you always want to ensure that they are aware of the privacy and confidentiality of the documents from applicants. You want to prepare for the interview process with your selection panel, again, if you can and if you have the time or resources to do so. Ensure that you know ahead of time who will ask what questions. So it's always good to split up the questions or give the first half to one individual, second half to another. Myself and Darlene, who was here on the call listening intently, she actually involved me in this process before, and we split up some questions and we both did an interview together. So it worked out really well, and she asked some questions that she knew a lot about, and I asked some questions that I knew a lot about. And what I will say here is if you do this with one candidate, do it with all of your candidates. So you want to be consistent in your approach. We will get to some more information about consistency in a little while, but it's always important to do the same thing in every situation. So you also want to include the information that was provided throughout the recruitment process to your selection panel. So this would include the job announcement or the job description, the advertisement, the selection criteria that will be followed, and if you have one, a template for assessing candidates. There is a recommended way to prepare for interviews within the research. So in order to ensure that you select and score fairly within interviews, ensure you go through a few steps beforehand. So you want to prepare a list of questions and events, which is here on the screen, for the interview to ensure you select the right person for the job. There are a lot of really great resources online when you simply Google interview questions. Be careful with this, of course, because not every question is suitable for every interview, but it can give you some ideas on how to tailor your questions within your own organization. You want to ensure that you develop key questions for the job that you have advertised for, and that the questions cover all essential functions. For example, if the job involves a lot of frontline or customer service interactions, you want to ensure that you have some type of question ensuring this is there. So for example, if you were hiring someone for a nonprofit organization like a museum and it dealt with a lot of customer service, you'd want to have situational or behavioral questions surrounding customer service. What would you do if you're in this situation, for example? And as I said earlier, be consistent always when you're rating interviews and conducting interviews. So some great ideas to use when you are in an interview include coming up with a rating scale so you can identify the best candidates, and also leaving detailed notes when you're actually going through the interview. So the beauty of it is that if you have two people or more in an interview, you have two sets of notes. So you can review the notes afterward and make them as detailed as possible when you're in the interview. Sometimes it's a little challenging to interview and write notes at the same time. So if you feel it's necessary, get someone else from your selection committee to come in and take some notes for you, even if they're not necessarily asking questions. And you can explain to the interviewee that this is just to allow you to get the most information written down effectively. You want to be upfront because there's nothing worse than having, 5 people interview you and not knowing, it's a little intimidating at times. It's happened to me actually many times. I've had 4 and 5 people interview me in different processes. So you want to make a plan for the recruitment. So ensure that you know what you're looking for. So you want to be sure of the qualifications, experience, and the personality or fit that you want the candidate to possess. Ensure that you advertise properly. You want to use the job ad that you have developed to write the advertisement. So it'll save you a lot of work. You can just use that job ad to write your advertisement. Change a few things, of course, but it's a great tool to make it a little bit easier on you. You want to be sure to ask the right questions in an interview that will help you evaluate the candidate properly. So this may include questions surrounding education and training, relevant work experience, skills specific to the role, leadership skills, communication, and teamwork, to name a few. So the fourth bullet here is not always applicable in all jobs, but in the case that you have like a technical role, you may need to conduct further evaluation testing, like a work test looking for a specific competency, for example. If it's a tech job, something like that, you'd need to tailor questions and test that the employee or the could be future employee knows what they're talking about. I guess the same as with, doctors or engineers, but they don't always work within the nonprofit sector, so it's different for every environment. And can everyone hear me clearly? I'm getting a bit of feedback in my microphone headset here. If anyone can just write clear or sounds good in the question box, that would be very helpful. Great. Okay, so we are still clear. It's just my headset. So you want to make sure that you also get together with the selection panel to compile a short list of candidates. So this can be as vigorous or as simple as you like. In the nonprofit environment, there may only be 2 people working for an organization, hoping to hire the third, and there might only be 2 people on the selection panel. So you want to ensure to have some communication between those on the panel. You might want to even draw up the rating score table that you're going to use to discuss the candidates. Make sure you prepare those candidates that you select for the shortlist for the interview. So give them all the same amount of time to prepare for the interview. So if you notify candidates by email, make sure you send the email for all candidates as soon as possible to give them the most notice. This gives them the opportunity to prepare for the interview, and you want to always confirm any arrangements or expectations in writing. So it could simply be an email confirming the time of the interview, the date, and the details if they need to bring anything outside the normal. Quite often, normally people will bring their resume or the job ad in case they are questioned on it. That's a good practice for the interviewee. So you do want to make sure that you clarify any information for the interviewees, and you want to ensure that you provide a private environment for the interview with no interruptions. And you, again, want to keep this consistent. So also you want to make sure that the candidate is doing most of the talking. So they actually say in the research about 90% of the talking needs to be done by the candidate. And back to the point about a private environment for the interview, I would suggest not conducting half the interviews at Tim Hortons and half of them in a boardroom, because clearly the 2 environments are not the same, and there could be, a disadvantage for someone that's in a noisy Tim Hortons with everyone looking at them. So it's something that you can consider. Just going to take a look at the question box there now. I think something came in there. Okay, clear, clear. And one individual said, "You sound great, but it says that Darlene Scott is talking," and that's funny because this account is under Darlene's name, so that's why it says that it's Darlene, but it's really Tina. So thanks for the remark, and it's really Tina doing the presentation. Darlene is here as well as an observer. Great. So, as I was saying, you want to be consistent, so don't interview half at Tim's or McDonald's or anything like that and half in your boardroom because it wouldn't be fair to those that aren't in a private environment. It's also very important to record the interview process in some way, so you want to have a detailed record of the interview. So don't include any subjective thoughts or anything that's not specifically job related. It's also suggested in the research that you should record how the selection was made. So if you did pick one candidate over another, do have a reason for it. And it could be because they had much more experience, much more education, whatever suits the job ad. And always ensure that the data that you do keep from this process is securely stored in a private and confidential area. Could be the HR file, for example. And anything you don't need to retain, ensure that you do shred it securely. Take the time to make the decision. And this is one of the most important things that I've seen in the research. Proper reference checking is often overlooked due to time constraints, or taking the time to analyze a candidate is often, shortened. So if you want to hire the best employee, it is recommended that you take the time to go through the process. And lastly, make an offer. So that's the exciting part, and it sounds like the easy part once all the other work is done. And now this all sounds pretty daunting, and I know it's only information, but you can make this process fairly simple. This is just a lot of information for you, and we will have the handouts and the PowerPoint provided so that you can review it at a later time and select what works best for you. Moving on, you always want to be aware of bias when you're selecting and scoring fairly. So the only way that I could provide a definition for bias was to directly copy and paste it. The source is down below, so I'm not taking anyone's information. This is dictionary.com, so they define bias as a particular tendency, trend, inclination, feeling, or opinion, especially one that is preconceived or unreasoned, a legal bias against older job applicants, the magazine's bias towards art rather than photography, or our strong bias in favor of the idea. So this is just an example of what bias is. It's kind of hard to explain other than looking at the definition. So it's unreasonable, hostile feelings or opinions about a social group or another factor that we should not be making our opinions be formed about. So you want to address bias in nonprofit organizations. As it is defined on the previous slide, you want to make sure that those on your selection committee and those in your workplace are aware of what bias is and how it can sneak through. So bias can actually sneak in through society, culture, it could be your upbringing or some of the personal filters that you subconsciously apply to your day-to-day life. I'll go through the types of bias. It's a heavy bit of information here on the slide, but I'm just going to read through them and you can just think about them. As I'm going through, you're probably going to say, wow, I didn't even know that was a thing. So hrcouncil.ca did a great job of listing these terms and definitions. So just sit back and relax while I read them. So you want to be aware of bias. The leniency or strictness bias occurs given people differ in how they evaluate people. So some interviews are very liberal and lenient, while others are critical and demanding. This bias tends to raise or lower the scores of people who are interviewed. The halo effect occurs when the interviewer lets one favored qualification, trait, or experience influence all other factors, resulting in an unduly high overall performance rating. So for example, if Tina was interviewing somebody and they had the same hair as Tina and she thought it was great, and she rated that candidate as the top candidate because she loved the hair or the makeup or what have you based on her appearance, then that would be wrong to do, and that's the halo effect. You subliminally or even consciously select someone as your favorite because of a bias. A Horn's effect, similar to the halo effect, allows one disfavored qualification, trait, or experience take precedence and result in unfairly low candidate rating. So, for example, if someone didn't have the same hair as me, or if it was not my opportune hairstyle, something like that, and I gave them a rating, I know this is an extremely foolish example, but that's how that can happen. I'd give them a low rating because they weren't the same as me. Similarity effect occurs when an evaluator rates a candidate based on characteristics the appraiser sees in themselves. So, for example, if I see myself as a great leader or someone with a lot of confidence, I would, I could be guilty of this effect if I let it um, come into my hiring process. So interviewers have an unconscious tendency to favor people who are physically and professionally similar to them. So, for example, if you had an individual that went to College of the North Atlantic and they were interviewing individuals from MUN and College of the North Atlantic, if they only gave high scores to those from College of the North Atlantic, then they could be guilty of that effect. And this is just an example, of course. You could have appraiser bias, which occurs when an evaluation is based on individual demographic differences. So personal beliefs, attitudes, assumptions, or preferences can lead to unfair evaluations of candidates. So an example of this would be, personal beliefs or attitudes. Um, if I believe that Tim Hortons coffee was the best coffee in the world, and I questioned my candidate on what kind of coffee they liked, and they didn't like Tim Hortons, then that could be an example of that. If they don't like what I like, then uh, the error could seep in there. Primacy effect is associated with the first impression. So interviewers' first impressions of a candidate can often play a powerful role in their subsequent assessment. It's very important to never let this impact your decision. You never really know if the first impression is a true uh, picture of who the person is, if it reflects their skills or their education or how hard they've worked their whole life. So just be careful of this. A contrast effect occurs when one individual's ranking is based on one's position relative to others in the group. So if the interview pool consists of a number of outstanding candidates, it's extremely difficult for an average candidate to be picked out as number one. But in a substandard pool, the average candidate may inexplicably stand out. So this is pretty self-explanatory here. Some more are here on the next page. Stereotyping, forming an opinion about someone given their gender, religion, race, um, without any evidence that this is related to a job. You could also create bias if you're inconsistent in questioning. So if you actually ask the candidates different questions during all of your interviews, this could create a major problem and it would create a skewed assessment of who would best perform the job. First impressions, as briefly mentioned on the previous slide, you don't want to make a snap judgment about someone based on their first impression. I do have a funny story about this, but we won't go into it. But I mean, if someone wore the color pink or the color blue and I didn't like what they were wearing and I just couldn't get past that, then I shouldn't let that create a true first impression of somebody, because you'd be surprised that that does not reflect their knowledge, skills, or abilities. A negative emphasis, so this would be involving a rejection of a candidate based on a small amount of negative information. Um, so you'd give the unfavorable information about someone. For example, if they were laid off from their job, and you gave that a whole pile of weight and you said they must be the worst employee in the world, that must be why they got laid off, when simply it could be an economic reason why they got laid off, and you place a negative weight on that, but you give it much more weight than the positive things, that would be a good example. So foolish examples, made up examples, but I think you get the picture. We also we went over the halo or the horn effect here already, and then the other one to be aware of is cultural noise. So all of this is online. This is a cut and paste, obviously. You can see the source on the bottom, but cultural noise. So an applicant might say that they have no problem reporting to someone younger than they are or work in a team setting when this is not actually how they truly feel. So be aware of that and create questions that probe for specific examples that get your candidate to tell you all about the situation. So don't just ask questions that are yes or no answers. All right, so these are a few others. I'm not going to go through them too much, but you can get the picture of bias and what it entails. I'm actually going to launch a quick poll again here now. Not sure where my polls went. That's great. So I closed the polls and now they're gone. So we won't spend too much time on that. But I was just going to ask, um, has anyone heard of bias before? So you can type it in the question box. Switching gears here a little. Has anyone heard of this before? Is anyone extremely surprised about this? Did they know it even existed? Or some people have heard of it. I'm seeing some responses. Is there anyone that hasn't heard of bias and can't believe that this is something that actually goes on? No? Okay, moving on. No issue. Here we go. So I do want you to take away a few things on bias. The biggest thing that I want you to take away here is that we should continue to be aware of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So whether this means doing a webinar course or session relating to these topics with your staff or your employees, or simply just reading up on it on your work time. These topics are always so interesting and they're continuously changing, so I find that I can't read enough about it. It's becoming a reality that, you know, things go on that aren't right and not ethical, so we must always be prepared, especially when we're making HR decisions. Another great thing that you can do is make those that are responsible for HR functions within your nonprofit organization aware of, you know, bias and how it can exist. So, for example, the selection panel, you might want to brief them on what can actually happen if people have bias in a hiring decision. It can be fairly simple, so you can provide formal or informal training. You could give a one-page reminder to your selection committee when you're doing the interview process, or you can casually have a conversation and just say, you know, did you know this existed? So I'm glad to see that there are some responses there that say they've heard of this before. Um, Before I read textbooks, which was a long time ago, I don't know if I knew it existed as much as it did. It's a great idea to also use tools available to ensure objectivity and fair comparison for applicants against selection criteria for interview purposes. And of course, this sounds like a jumble of information, but a tool could simply be a selection panel, using one, or objective viewpoints, getting different opinions, or even a refresher on the different forms of bias. A tool as well could also be a simple screening matrix, so to ensure you're fair in your process. So this is an actual example with the source on the bottom there of a shortlisting matrix. So if you're finding it really tough and you have 7 candidates and you don't know which ones to move through the short list or the very short list, then you can actually go through a screening matrix like this. It doesn't have to be as intense as this one is. It could have 4 things, and you might want to rate individuals on those specific to your job ad. So you don't have to go crazy with it, but it might be a tool that'll help you. And it might even have 2 columns, education and qualifications, maybe 3, work history, who knows. In order to be fair when selecting and scoring interviews fairly, you want to base the process on the job itself. So you want this screening to be based on essential tasks and skills for the position as you have indicated in the job description. So always you want to comply with human rights legislation. And that's a no-brainer. So there's lots of great resources on Canadian human rights legislation online. We actually had a session here a couple of weeks ago on human rights. It was extremely interesting. So we hope to have one of those sessions again, and I'm sure you'd all be interested in hearing a bit more about that. They currently don't do webinars right now, but we're gonna, see if there's any possibility to do a webinar in the future, just so we can have it available for everyone. There are questions that you should never ever ask during an interview. So you should never ask any question that discriminates against human rights legislation. It's not acceptable to do so. So I'm sure you've heard many examples, but some examples that might not be, you know, standing out to you would be, oh, I went to South High School. What year did you graduate? Believe it or not, this is not a fair question to ask in an interview, as it can indicate someone's age, and this is a protected ground. So you also don't want to say, I love your accent. Where are you from? Never ever ask this in an interview. And this one's a bit more, you know, easy to see. Ethnic origin is a protected human right, so you never want to ask those types of questions. And absolutely never do you ever want to ask, how many kids do you have? Do you have kids? Are you planning kids? And this is generally an unacceptable question for society, but especially in an interview, you don't want to ask those questions. If you do work with someone already and they've already been through the hiring process, and for example, if I had a picture on my desk and I had kids and I had a picture of them, then it's okay to ask. Or once a person's in the job, it's okay to, discuss things like that to show that you have an interest in someone's life, but not in the interview. You never ever want to ask if people have plans for a family, because under the Human Rights Act, it could be considered pregnancy discrimination or something along those lines. So this is pretty self-explanatory. I know I don't really need to tell all of you this, but it's good to keep up on the info and keep your selection panel informed should you decide to go that route. So checking references is something that there are many different opinions on, but in the research it does definitely suggest that you should always check references, especially, and some people only check for the final candidates. Some only check for the final candidate, singular. You want to always ask permission to check a candidate for their references. So you might even want to implement a process by where you have a form in the interview and you get them to sign off their permission on whether you can contact their references. I've seen this done in different organizations. Um, and when you check references, it allows you to probe issues to get a full sense of the candidate, so you can get a sense of their values, their nature, their approach to work, and how they interact with others. So it kind of finalizes the process and reconfirms your decision to hire somebody. So, glowing references are great when an interview never really brought that out in a person. So you never know. You never judge a book by its cover. So this is it from me. I know we are finishing a little bit early, but I would like to keep you all here to get a discussion going. And one of the questions I asked earlier was, did anyone have any experience with bias before? Had they heard about it? Has anyone been involved with hiring or selecting employees? Love to get your answers in the question box. Okay, we've got some questions coming in as well, so that's great. I do have a comment here that it does say, I've heard of bias before, but we all think that we're free of bias. And that's completely true, because, you don't think that you have bias when you make decisions, but it could be there in the strangest ways. And you could be subconsciously creating bias. Another individual said that biases are so interesting, and like you said, many interviewers might not even notice that they are doing it. This individual in the question box said, I think that some of the biases can interlap. For example, the interviewer may be biased to someone similar to them, which is the similarity effect, and then knowingly or unknowingly seek something really great about them, which they will then give them more weight when evaluating them. And this is so true. I never even thought about it that way. So that would be the halo effect as well. So this individual also said that webinars like this are a great reminder for interviewers to think about their own thought processes and decision making. And thank you, Carla, for that comment. That's exactly right. I think that there's nothing we can't learn a bit more about or further refine. I've got a question now. How long should I keep files from a competition? Resumes, interviews, questions, reference checks, etc. Well, if it's not the individual that you ultimately selected or the top two, in some of the research it did suggest that you should get rid of this information, shred it because it's private and confidential if you didn't select the individual. And quite often if you go through, a fair and consistent process, you ensure that you rate candidates properly. You should only need to keep the top candidate's resume for, in their HR file for a long period of time, and you may want to keep the other one. However, there's really no need to keep anything other than the one that you hired. If you expect that you might need to defend legally your decision to hire someone, then maybe you might want to keep it. But if it's very clear who the top candidate is and you've gone through a fair and consistent process, I do not think that you need to keep the files from the competition. You may want to keep something on file in a private folder on your computer about the rating if you need to. And as for the candidate that is actually selected, I would keep that forever, for as long as they're in your employ, because you know it just shows why you hired that candidate, and over time it'll reconfirm for you. I hope that answers your question. There's another question here. Should we give a scorecard to a candidate in advance of an interview? Um, I've seen this done. For example, uh, there are organizations that rate candidates on different competencies, so I think it's fine in a case like that. But any other scorecard, I don't necessarily think it would be helpful to give in advance. You can do your best to prepare individuals for an interview, like tell them what you might be answering questions on, tell them what to expect, but I don't think a physical scorecard should be given. I hope that answers your question, because you don't want to give like the rubric or the scorecard to them to know exactly what they're being rated on. But it is okay to give a general sense of some of the things that they may be rated based on. Okay, and we've got a couple of yeses to say that people have heard of bias there in the question box. That's great. There is one individual that has had extensive experience working with government hiring, and that's Elaine. So I hope you don't mind me saying your name, Elaine, but I know you've got great experience with government, and I can only imagine that it's a little bit different in the nonprofit sector. So, you could be limited with people. You might not have the ability to have a huge selection panel. You don't have as much people to do the work necessarily if it's a two-person nonprofit organization. Great, thank you. One bias that Jason often hears in rural Newfoundland areas is it's who you know, not what you know, that gets you the job. And this is the famous saying. I highly agree, Jason. I've heard that so many times, and I often laugh at that because I say, well, I know nobody, so I guess I'm not getting the job. So I hope you'll all have a little chuckle at that. But I've never known anyone, and that's it's proven difficult in examples like that. So it is definitely a bias, and we need to get away from that. So we need to avoid that. And there's a few thank yous. You're very welcome. Thank yous for answering the question. Um, there is a question here. What are your thoughts on social media's influencing on screening, and can they play into bias? For example, LinkedIn shows a picture, which is different from a paper copy of a resume, which would not normally have a picture attached. Also, Facebook and Twitter, etc., can show a lot about someone's personal life, which can sometimes show the company their values and characteristics. But it can also lead to bias, such as the horns effect, when employers are trying to see if they can come across something unprofessional or unlikable. What if their research comes up with more about one candidate versus another? This is an extremely important question. Thank you, Carla, for asking that. This is so true. I've heard a lot lately that in today's world, they are people hiring individuals, whether no matter what company or organization they're with, they do check social media. And you definitely could form biases based on everything that they have online could be very professional. It's not necessarily pictures of people drinking or out at parties, and it could be extremely professional, but biases could be formed if people think about those different forms of bias. I completely agree. So maybe the trick is to not look at social media to evaluate a candidate or not provide a lot of weight. But once you look, I mean, it's really hard to erase what you've seen, I guess. I hope that answers your question. Um, it can definitely play into the bias. I definitely think that. And it definitely creates, you know, I don't know, a bit of an unknown area that I think there needs to be more research on how it indeed impacts hiring decisions. And so true. And what if, what if people look individuals up and with what Jason said about the who you know, maybe they're looking to see how many people you do know. And maybe people are looking to see how many important people you do know. And that would be just wrong. So very, very easy to uh, have bias in that situation. Thank you so much for that question. Another individual had to leave early, so they just said thank you and they will forward the notes to the board on this session. Um, Someone else said it might be worth mentioning about outside influences, such as a board member contacting the selection committee trying to push forward one candidate over the other. And that's definitely a good point. I'm not going to mention the name there, um, for privacy, but it is definitely a good point. You know, it's not who you know, or it is who you know. It's not what you know necessarily. And uh, what's the word? There's a word on that, trying to push through family and friends or one candidate that they prefer over the other. If someone can, yes, nepotism. Thank you, Jason and Elaine. So, that's quite common in a case like that. Um, if someone is trying to push one member over another, I think you need to just go back to the selection committee, whoever is making the decision, whoever's done the notes, the groundwork, ensuring to treat people fairly. So I don't necessarily see it fair to push through one member over another because of an outside opinion. So again, this is just my opinion and it's not a rule by no means, but it's always good to go back to the concrete information that has been collected during the process and ensuring that you get the best person for the job. So not basing it on personal relationships or who knows what, but going strictly to the bona fide job requirements. Okay, another question. Thank you so much. Yes, maybe it's best to write down what will be evaluated beforehand to be fair. So as mentioned in the presentation, it's always a good idea to be clear on what you're going to evaluate when you go through a process and ensure that you don't stray from that. And also another good point that's come up a lot is to be consistent. So um, it speaks to a lot of the questions here. Always be consistent, always draw upon the information you actually have collected from your candidates, education, experience, things that actually make a difference to how they would be in a job. So it's great. Okay, are there any other questions before we end off 2 minutes early? comments? Does anyone have any topics that are burning that they really want answered? Because you can email me, and my contact information here is here on the screen. A thank you, a great job, thank you. And thanks to you for all being here and participating. I'm not sure why I didn't get the poll working, but I'm going to have that fixed for next time. So I do look forward to doing more webinars on topics that you like. If you have one that we haven't done a webinar on yet and you'd like to send it to me by email, please do so. I encourage you to do so. A lot of thank yous coming in there now, and great presentation. Great job. Thank you so much. And thanks to you all for contributing and writing your questions, because that's what makes it that much more valuable, is when you get the different opinions. Similar to the hiring process, you have objective opinions and questions, because we're all different. So that's great. So have a great afternoon, and be sure to reach out. I will be sending out a very brief survey just to see how you found today, if there's anything we can do to improve, or anything else we missed. Thank you. Signing off now. Have a good one.